Imagine that you're reading a fantasy story and it takes place in a kingdom that suffered a devastating war, and the invading army razed the capital city and occupied the land and lived off the land for a couple of years. But now around 20 years has passed from that point and the countryside looks fine. We only see like one monument celebrating the heroes who died during that war, but that's pretty much it. There are no scars of the past, no shortages of any resources, no displaced population or desolated areas. It would feel kind of off, wouldn't it? One of the most underrated mistakes that I see in storytelling is writers not understanding how time works. You might think that it's not that big of a problem because, well, the main characters, the central plot of the story, and the world building around all those things are way more important. And you are right. But consistent timeline and a good grounded understanding of the passing of time is the glue that holds those things together. Before we address the actionable step to actually fix time problems, let me show you how important time is for stories. The example that I gave in the beginning and any other discrepancies or clash of narrative presentation in your story is called narrative dissonance, and it can heavily impact the believability of your story. Disconnecting past events from the present day consequences can pull you out of the experience. You will subconsciously just stop believing in this world because the past is not really connected to the story that you're reading. You see, consistent timeline and long-lasting consequences of events in your story is crucial to hold your audience suspension of disbelief, or as it is more commonly known, immersion. The reason why we love stories, why we resonate with them, and why we love the characters and what is happening moves us, is when we fundamentally understand that what's happening makes sense. You know, when actions have logical consequences. This character kills this character, and those things happen as a result of this action. This is like writing 101, right? And most writers seem to understand it for the purpose of the current events in their story, but not really for things that happened in the past, especially a long time ago in their stories. They will mention those events here and there, but not really commit to it and show us the full consequences of those events. And the very moment the narrative dissonance kicks in, you start to feel disconnected from the story. The story becomes fake, not really engaging. And even if it has some great ideas, some philosophical dilemma or some moral problems that it wants to discuss, and maybe they are mature, but nobody will really care that much because the story is not engaging, so why bother? That little example that I gave you in the very beginning of the video, that is an actual thing in the Warcraft universe. In this fantasy universe, a massive conflict known as the First Orc Invasion ravaged the kingdom of Stormwind. The orcs completely overran the land, breaching the walls of the capital city and razing it to the very ground. And after their victory, the orcs occupied the kingdom of Stormwind for 3 years before being finally pushed back with an alliance counterattack. However, in World of Warcraft, set roughly 20 years after the orcs were first time defeated, there are barely any traces of the war. The capital city of Stormwind has been rebuilt in a pretty astonishing speed, and the surrounding region of the Elven Forest shows almost no scars from that conflict, aside from like a single monument honoring the heroes of the war. But besides that, the area is a lush, thriving forest with farmlands and really nothing else going on. This lack of lasting impact of a devastating war 20 years ago is especially strange given the fact that orcs are notorious in this universe to disregard nature. They are known for destroying forests to make their war machines and build their own strongholds, and they often leave the land they inhabit completely desolate. They're actually so used to living in desolated areas that later in the story, the orcs have chosen an arid desert as their home because it felt familiar. And there are other areas that mention that war and shows the consequences of that war, but not Elven Forest, not the main area of the capital city, which the most fighting took place. It seems like the writers just selectively decided when and where the after effects of the war will remain visible and where they will not, creating a very inconsistent world building. Another example is Avatar: The Last Airbender. In the first show, we clearly see that the world operates in a ancient/early medieval type of technology. We see this in the everyday life of different nations that are portrayed in the story. This is not just limited to backwater villages or tribes. We see this level of technology even in very big cities. And we also see that very often what could be done by technology today is done by elemental bending, which is like a magical system in this universe, which makes sense. Technology is invented to solve problems, to make our everyday life easier, more convenient. So if there is a magic system that can do that, and people who use that magic system are pretty prominent, that there's quite a lot of them in this universe, then yeah, there is no reason to make technology if I can fix something with elemental bending. Although we do see technologically advanced machines, mainly by the Fire Nation, so the people who can bend the element of fire. And all of them seems to be coal-fueled or use heat as their energy. I admit some of their designs are pretty wild. But okay, fine. The show is pretty clear that this level of technology is limited to the Fire Nation and only limited to the war machines. There's a big war going on for almost a century. War have problems, technology solve problems. Bending fire cannot really fix the problem of, soldiers dying from projectiles. So, okay, pretty weak, but fine, right? The show is pretty consistent with that. But then Avatar: The Legend of Korra comes. And this one takes place 70 years after Avatar: The Last Airbender, and what we see is cars, electricity, radios, high-rise architecture, trams, cameras, microphones, and all of that in a city that didn't even existed before, and it was built in the last 70 years. To make this point clear, that is a jump of technology level for almost 1,000 years in our world. And in our world, magic don't even exist, which would certainly slow down the advancements of technology. That is a difference of the 5th century level of technology to 1920s level of technology in just 70 years. Those examples that I just gave you are just ones of many where writers do not seem to understand how time works. So what you should do to keep your timeline in check and also use time as a very effective tool to benefit your story. First of all, commit. If you want to have an important event that happened in the past and you want to utilize it in your story, commit to it. Don't write down something just because having a great war or a plague that devastated the land is a cool thing to reference sometimes in your story. Show the consequences of those events. Remember that they happen, that there are people that probably are still affected by those events. Even if you don't want to use it as the main plot, you can have everything around it be revolving around that past event that was important. I always loved KOTOR 2 for exactly that. Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2 takes place 5 years after 2 major wars in the Star Wars universe. First, the Mandalorian War, which was a devastating invasion from a warmongering culture that devastated the Republic. And just after that war ended, the Jedi Civil War happened inside the territories of the Republic. Even though those wars are done, they are concluded by the beginning of the story, or the main places and locations that the main character goes to, they show how big of an impact those 2 devastating wars had in the past. Nar Shaddaa have a refugee problem because of the displacement of population. People left the outer rim that were engulfed in war. Telos is a planet that the Republic is trying to rebuild after the war because it was completely decimated. The political crisis on Onderon between the military junta and the Queen loyalists is caused by the fact that the planet was abandoned by the Republic during the war. Even though both wars have ended, the Republic is still struggling to hold stability in the galaxy. And those consequences are not only visible in a big political level and a societal level, but also in a much smaller scope. For example, we see plenty of soldiers that turn into raiders or mercenaries because there is no longer need for them. The war has ended. There is no reason to have a massive army during peacetime, especially that we need to focus on rebuilding. And some of those raiders and bandits can be soldiers from the army that lost one of those wars. And they are pariahs and they have nowhere else to go. So they turn to raiding and banditry. The best thing about it, the main story has nothing to do with those previous two wars. But all the characters that you meet, all the conflicts that you encounter, all of that constantly reference those two wars because they were a huge deal just 5 years ago in this universe. Next step is mind the technology. I'm not only talking about technology advancing slower or faster, just like in the Avatar example that I gave before, but also that in low technology settings, lore keeping and historiography is usually less advanced, so events of the past are not really that clear. This is actually an amazing tool that you can use in your storytelling. If you write a story in a low technology fantasy setting, you can actually reference past civilization or past events very vaguely or even highly romanticized, because the common people and even lore keepers and scholars will not really have that clear understanding of history. You need to understand that the science of discovering historical truth is very, very difficult. And even in modern days, we highly rely on biology, on chemistry, and other scientific fields to help uncover history. And also we live in a globalized age when we have access to historical sources from anywhere from the world. That's why you can be someone from Sweden and be an expert in Japanese history, which is absolutely not a thing in a low technology fantasy setting. People will have a very, very limited amount of historical sources to base their knowledge upon. You probably know how much the Roman Empire meant for the development of at least the Western civilization, how big of a deal it was for us. But what is actually fascinating is when you actually read about how the Roman Empire was viewed from the perspective of people from medieval ages or the Renaissance. They had a very romanticized view of it. They didn't understand the Roman Empire like we did today. They saw this Roman Empire as a mythical thing, the golden age of humanity, of civilization, the apex of humanity that sadly fell down. And it was almost like a religious dogma to aspire towards it. That is why some rulers like Charlemagne kept talking about rebuilding the Roman Empire, or that there were countries that literally called themselves the Holy Roman Empire centuries after the Roman Empire fell. And there is a lot of truth in the view that they held in the medieval ages about the Roman Empire, but they lacked the nuanced understanding of it. They lacked the knowledge about its flaws and what actually led to its downfall. So, to implement the flawed perspective of the past, the first thing you need to do is actually create the event of the past, but create them as they were, create them truthfully, and add as much detail as much as it is important in your story. The more important those events in the past are for your current story, the more details you should add and the more you should think about how those events actually happen. Let's say there was a long war in the past in your universe. Let's call it the 100-Year War, and it completely reshaped how your world looked like right now. But all the information about that war suspiciously come from just one general, from just one perspective, from his army's perspective, which is very flawed and very black and white, especially that he won the war so he could rewrite certain events. Now, you can do so much more things with that idea as a writer. You can have some characters discover alternative history of that. There might be some cult or some different faction in your universe that knows those events of the past from a completely, vastly different perspective, which is also flawed, which is also biased. Now you can have a very intriguing political conflict between two factions. One of them will try to show their own version of events, the other one show their own version of events, and they will cherry pick the convenient parts of it. And the best part, you don't need to uncover any of that. You don't need to show anything directly and concretely. You can have the main character discover some parts of the truth, but never, you as a writer, never show all the truth. Let that sink in and let the imagination of your reader actually absorb that and make theories about what actually happens. There is so many things you can do with that. Now, when I said all of that, I also need to tell you that there are things that you need to avoid, because there are some easy pitfalls that you can fall into. And especially if you want to implement the false and biased perspective of the past, will lead you to use the unreliable narrator. Unreliable narrator, if you don't know, is writing things that can turn out to be false because they are portrayed from the perspective of someone who is biased. And sadly, this is very often a lazy excuse for some writers to hand-wave any inconsistency or problems in their story. Things don't make sense in my story? Well, it was written by the unreliable narrator. Characters no longer act according to their personality? Well, it was told by the unreliable narrator. Sadly, it's a very lazy, convenient excuse to not solve your in-universe problems. But I believe that, like with any writing tool, you can do it right. So to avoid overusing the lazy excuse of the unreliable narrator is, first, as I said previously, create the entire story as it was, and stick to it. Don't change it in the middle of doing something. But then, if you want to use the unreliable narrator, try to hint what exactly is unreliable. Try to make it make sense. If the unreliable narrator is this general who wrote down the story from his perspective, show his personality through his writing, and that will be a big hint for the reader what actually is unreliable and what is reliable. The next pitfall that I usually see with time is the butterfly effect, or more precisely, the lack of it. Something that I see especially in fantasy storying is that if you have a story that culminates in a giant epic battle between good and evil, and finally the evil is vanquished, everything just goes back to normal. Everyone is happy and the world is saved. Which is not how reality works. Sure, most of those stories actually stop at the moment when the good guys win, and they never actually continue the story to probably avoid, showing all the deeper consequences of a giant conflict. But I believe it's wasting the potential of a story. And that's why I loved this scene from The Mandalorian Season 1, which takes place after the toppling of the Empire. The main character enters this building, and there are Imperial remnants sitting here on a planet on the fringes of the galaxy. You can see that they have worn out armor and cheaper weapons that they used to, and it would make sense that there are still loyalists of the old Empire, even years after the Empire actually fell. It was a really nice touch of world building, showing that, the Empire didn't just poof from the existence. And I heard that there were books that actually committed to it, and they were actually good, but I never read them. But that was one of those examples. However, if you want to learn more and get in touch with me and learn with other like-minded individuals, I have a mastermind coming in that you can access in the link in the description down below. Anyway, take care of your timelines, and I will see you when I see you. Have a great day.